And the purpose of your visit, sir? Ambassador. Everything seems to be in order. Welcome.
Everything appears to be in order, sir. You may proceed.
Thank you.
The floodlights at the border checkpoint burned white against the night, flattening faces into paperwork and shadows. Daniel Reed sat still behind the steering wheel, window down, passport resting on his palm like an offering. The air smelled of hot asphalt and diesel. Somewhere, a radio crackled and went silent. The officer leaned in too close. His badge caught the light. His eyes did not. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, already reaching for the door. Daniel's jaw tightened. He complied. The gravel bit through the soles of his shoes as he stepped out. Another officer circled the car, slow, deliberate, hand brushing the holster as if reminding it of its purpose. "Reason for travel. Official business," Daniel answered. Measured. Years of training pressed his voice into shape. The first officer smirked. "Funny. You don't look official." Oz. Cameras hummed. A truck idled behind them, its headlights glaring like an audience. Daniel felt the familiar pressure behind his ribs. The old, learned calculation of survival. Do not escalate. Do not flinch. They searched the trunk. Too long. They searched his phone. Legally. Casually. The officer's thumb scrolled, lips pursed in mild disappointment. "Who do you think you are?" the officer asked. Daniel met his eyes. "Someone you should treat with respect." The officer laughed, sharp and short. "Not tonight." A supervisor was called. A form slapped onto the hood. The cuffs came out, metal whispering open. Behind the glass doors of the checkpoint, a seal gleamed on the wall. Gold, unmistakable. The officer froze mid-motion as his radio squawked Daniel's name, followed by a title that cut the night clean in half. The border lane narrowed into a funnel of concrete and light. Daniel Reed eased the car forward until the red line swallowed his front tires. He shut off the engine. Silence rushed in, broken by radios and boots. "Passport," the officer said. Daniel handed it over. "Here." The officer flipped it open, slow. "Where you headed?" "Across the border. Official business." "Official," the officer repeated. "With who?" Daniel held his gaze. "The United States government." The officer smiled without warmth. "Step out of the vehicle." "Am I being detained?" "Step out." Daniel opened the door. Gravel shifted under his feet. Another officer appeared at his shoulder, too close. "Hands where I can see them." "They are." "Reason for travel." "I've answered." The officer snorted. "Funny thing. Your answers don't match your attitude." Daniel inhaled. "Am I free to go?" The trunk popped open. A hand rifled through folders stamped confidential. Daniel turned. "Those are protected materials." The officer didn't look up. Everything's protected until it isn't. A phone was taken from Daniel's pocket. "You don't have consent," Daniel said. The officer scrolled. "You don't need to consent." "That's incorrect." "Watch your tone." A truck horn blared behind them. The line backed up, eyes pressed from windshields. Daniel felt heat crawl up his neck, the old burn of being displayed. "Why are you really here?" the officer asked. "For work." "Doing what?" "Diplomacy." Laughter cracked. "That a joke?" Daniel said nothing. The officer leaned in. "You people always say that." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Say what?" "That you're important." A supervisor approached, glancing at the passport. "What's the issue?" "Suspicious behavior," the officer said. "Doesn't add up." The supervisor nodded without reading. "Secondary." Daniel was guided toward the glass doors. "This is unlawful," he said. "Tell it inside." The room smelled of disinfectant. A bench bolted to the floor. Form slapped down. "Sit." "I request counsel." "After processing." Cuffs clicked open. "Are you arresting me?" "Temporary detention." "For what charge?" "Silence." Daniel stared at the seal on the wall. The eagle's wings spread wide, immaculate. He had sworn to it, represented it, believed in its promise even when it failed him. A radio chirped. The supervisor stiffened. "Say again." The dispatcher repeated the name, added the title. The officer's face drained. "That's not possible." Daniel finally spoke. "It is." No one moved. The cuffs hovered, unclosed, heavy with consequence. The holding room smelled of bleach and fear. Daniel sat on the cold metal bench, arms crossed, eyes scanning the stamped forms scattered across the counter. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, humming like a low accusation. The air was too still, thick with the weight of officers who treated the law as a shield rather than a guideline. "Name," one officer muttered, barely looking up from the clipboard. "Daniel Reed, United States Ambassador to Canada." "Was." The pen hovered. Then the officer's lips twisted, a practiced neutrality that didn't reach his eyes. "Reason for crossing." "I've already stated it." The second officer chuckled, sliding a folder across the counter. "We just need verification protocol. Don't take it personally." Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension coiling in his chest like a steel spring. He had faced prejudice before, but the procedural weight of bureaucracy was different. It had its own teeth. From the corner, a junior agent leaned against the wall, arms folded. He watched, hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Sir, maybe we should." The first officer snapped. "Quiet. Procedure." "You don't question procedure." Daniel's hands tightened around the edge of the bench. Each officer's gesture, the slight smirk, the delayed response, was a silent code he had memorized over decades. "You are expendable until we decide otherwise." "You're detaining me unlawfully," he said. "Detention is standard," the officer replied, tone flat, devoid of empathy. "Secondary inspection. Nothing personal." Daniel's mind ran through every interaction, every misread glance. Years of diplomacy, careful phrasing, and restraint collided with raw injustice. He remembered the last time he had been stopped at a regional checkpoint, treated like a suspect because of the color of his skin. It had left him with a muscle memory of caution. A phone rang behind the glass partition. The officer barked a response. Words clipped bureaucratic. Daniel caught fragments. "Delay. Verification. Ambassador." The room seemed to shrink around him, walls lined with forms and indifferent faces. "Can you provide identification again?" the first officer asked. Daniel extended his diplomatic ID. The officer flipped it over, frowned, then slid it back. "We'll need to confirm with headquarters." "Confirmation is unnecessary," Daniel said, voice low but precise. "This identification grants me immediate clearance. This treatment violates federal and international law." The officer shrugged, as though Daniel's rights were optional. "Rules are rules." Daniel felt the room pulse with every overlooked protocol, every act of dismissal. Silence became its own form of violence. A few officers shuffled papers, whispered into radios, glanced at him like he was an inconvenience to be endured rather than a person with authority. The junior agent lingered near the door, visibly conflicted. He whispered something to a colleague. The first officer's gaze snapped to him, sharp, disciplinary. The young man flinched. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He could see the cracks in the machinery of power, the hesitation, the unease, the thin veneer of impartiality. He made a mental note. Every gesture, every word, every illegal search would be documented. They were building a record against themselves. Hours passed. Forms signed. Phones called. Head shook. Each response was a microaggression, masked in legality. The weight of systemic bias pressed against Daniel's ribs. Finally, a voice crackled through a radio. "Verification complete. Ambassador Reed. Proceed as required." The first officer froze, then masked shock with composure. Daniel collected his documents, every motion deliberate. He felt the familiar burn of anger, tempered with the coolness of strategy. The junior agent lingered near the doorway, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Daniel stepped past the line that had held him captive for hours, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow on every injustice he had endured. The world outside the holding room had not changed. The system remained intact, but now it had been exposed to scrutiny. For the first time that day, Daniel allowed himself a measured breath. He knew the next steps would be public, legal, and deliberate. The officer's power had limits they had forgotten in their assumptions. The junior agent's eyes followed him, conflicted, as if silently promising that not everyone had surrendered to the machinery of prejudice. And somewhere beyond the checkpoint, the floodlights hummed. The night waited, indifferent. The fight had only just begun. Daniel Reed sat in the back of a gray government SUV, the leather seat cold beneath him, hands folded across his lap. Outside, the border lights retreated into darkness, leaving only the soft glow of the dashboard. Phones rang incessantly in the front cabin. Clipped voices exchanged terse instructions, names, and titles he barely recognized. The machinery of authority was grinding, and he was the piece that didn't fit. "Ambassador Reed," said a voice from the front seat. It was a senior agent, crisp and detached. "We verified your status. Secondary inspection was unnecessary, but protocol does not authorize unlawful detention," Daniel interrupted. His tone was steady, but every syllable cut like a scalpel. "Nor does it excuse racial profiling." The agent paused, fingers hovering over the console. "I understand, sir, but the officer involved. He's within the chain of command. He will be investigated, but this will take time." Daniel exhaled. Time was a luxury he didn't have when damage had already spread. The institution allowed him to act with impunity. That is the core issue. Names, dates, times, and recordings. "I want every detail on paper, immediately." A driver cleared his throat. "Do you want a formal complaint filed?" "Yes. And copies sent to Internal Affairs, the State Department, and my office in Ottawa." The SUV hit the highway, headlights cutting through fog like scalpels. Daniel leaned back, mind tracing every moment at the checkpoint. The officer's smirk, the way he rifled through his belongings, the dismissive language masked as procedure. Each action had been deliberate, yet casual, the epitome of institutionalized bias. Phone buzzed. Daniel picked it up. Congressional liaison spoke fast, clipped. "Sir, your experience has triggered a preliminary review. Video footage is being pulled. The officer has been placed on administrative leave pending inquiry." "Administrative leave is not accountability," Daniel said sharply. "I want a thorough investigation. Every witness, every step. I will not allow bureaucratic shielding to obscure truth." There was a pause, then quiet acknowledgement. Daniel hung up. His stomach tightened. In diplomacy, words were currency. Here, words were weapons wielded unevenly. The SUV stopped outside a government facility. Daniel stepped out, briefcase in hand. The building smelled of antiseptic and authority. In the lobby, uniformed officers passed by, eyes sliding over him without recognition. A receptionist nodded faintly. Daniel offered a formal smile. Inside the conference room, a chain of command meeting was already in progress. Faces, titles, and ranks formed a wall of procedural weight. At the center sat the officer responsible, expression controlled, posture defensive. Daniel noted the subtle shifts. The officer's hand on a folder labeled Incident Report, the slight hesitation when meeting his gaze, the mechanical politeness layered over simmering defensiveness. "Ambassador Reed," the senior agent began. "We are documenting the events. You may recount your version for the record." Daniel stood. "I will provide a factual account. Every interaction, every microaggression, every illegal search. This is not personal. This is systemic." The officer cleared his throat. "I followed protocol. I acted according to regulations. Any perception of misconduct is unfortunate, but unintentional." Daniel's jaw tightened. Unintentional. You rifled through my personal items. You detained me unlawfully. You made assumptions based solely on my appearance. That is intentional bias embedded within the framework of your power. The room shifted. Words were weapons here. Every statement carried potential for exposure or defense. A lawyer for the department interjected. Mr. Reed, we acknowledge your concerns. Our process ensures impartial review. I have observed impartiality fail, Daniel said. And I am here to document it. You will not whitewash it. You will not shield it behind procedural ambiguity. Every recording, every witness, every form must be preserved. Otherwise, accountability is meaningless. The officer smirked faintly. You make it sound like I planned this. You did not plan it, perhaps. But you executed it with a level of casual certainty that reveals the culture you are part of. That is the point. Culture enforces injustice far more efficiently than premeditation. The senior agent shifted uncomfortably. Notes were taken. Folders shuffled. Phones hummed. Daniel watched, counting every sigh, every glance away, every hesitated word. This room was a microcosm of the border system itself. Authority layered over moral evasion. A junior analyst spoke quietly. Sir, there's a body cam clip. It contradicts the officer's account. We can submit it now. The officer's eyes flicked to the screen, face paling slightly. Daniel's pulse did not quicken. He had learned to wait. Systems crumble slowly, but under pressure, even the seemingly invincible expose themselves. Submit it, Daniel said. Transparency is non-negotiable. Minutes passed while footage loaded. The officer shifted in his seat. His voice tightened. This does not capture context. Context is irrelevant when legality is violated, Daniel replied. Intent is not justification for abuse of power. Pattern, record, and impact matter. A senior supervisor leaned forward. We will conduct a full review. Administrative protocols require documentation and cross-examination. You will be interviewed separately to corroborate your statements. Daniel nodded. Ensure the review includes systemic factors. Officers' prior behavior, complaints ignored, patterns in secondary inspections targeting minority diplomats. This is not an isolated event. The room remained tense. Conversations overlapped, terms like incident report, due process, and internal investigation bounced in clipped tones. Daniel noted the words that hid action: review, protocol, verification. In these euphemisms, the structure of power attempted to neutralize injustice without acknowledging it. When the meeting adjourned, Daniel gathered his papers. The officer left first, posture tight, eyes flicking once to Daniel before sliding the door shut behind him. He smelled of overused cologne and authority. Daniel's briefcase felt heavier now, loaded not just with documents but with the responsibility to record, expose, and challenge. Outside the building, the evening air hit him like cold water. Streetlights reflected in puddles, creating fractured mirrors of the world above. Daniel paused, inhaling the scent of exhaust and wet asphalt. The fight was no longer confined to a checkpoint. It had spread into offices, hearings, and reports, a web of authority that had underestimated the vigilance of its target. The junior analyst approached him. Sir, I've never seen someone document so meticulously. If this goes public, it will be a clear record. Daniel's eyes scanned the horizon, distant lights flickering like witnesses. It will go public. That is the point. Authority must answer when it abuses the powerless. Silence is complicity. He walked toward the waiting SUV, mind already moving through the next steps. Legal review, media strategy, and controlled exposure. Every conversation, every recorded exchange would be ammunition. The officer had power, yes, but power always leaves traces, cracks, and vulnerabilities. And Daniel Reed would trace them all. The chain of command had been confronted, not broken but challenged. Each word, each gesture, Each record was a step toward accountability. The system trembled slightly, though it did not fall. Daniel understood the fight would be long. But for the first time that day he felt momentum shift. Inside the SUV, headlights cutting across the highway, Daniel looked out at the dark borderlands, the artificial lights, and the bureaucratic walls he had just shaken. One day, he thought, justice would not require him to fight alone. For now, it required patience, precision, and an unwavering refusal to be invisible. The morning news cycle was merciless. Daniel Reed sat in his office in Ottawa, the window open to a pale gray sky, the hum of traffic below punctuated by occasional honks. On the desk, multiple screens displayed news clips, social media posts, and internal memos. Every headline twisted the event at the border into angles he had not authorized, yet his presence in the footage made it impossible to ignore. Ambassador Reed was detained at the border under suspicious circumstances, one anchor said, voice clipped. The footage showed the officer rifling through his documents, body cam angles cutting sharply between Daniel's calm compliance and the officer's smirk. Authorities claim procedural adherence. Daniel rubbed his temples. Every moment of injustice, every bureaucratic dodge was now amplified. The systemic weight of authority, the casual disregard, the hidden bias, was visible to millions. Yet the framing suggested he had overreacted, that he was the anomaly, not the officer. Phone buzzed. It was the junior agent from the border facility. Sir, the internal footage, the body cam, you're going to want to see this. It's going viral, but it's uncut. Daniel clicked play. The officer's voice, tone casual in the way casualness masks aggression, echoed. Step out of the vehicle. Don't argue. His hands rifled through folders, paused on Daniel's diplomatic papers. The officer laughed under his breath. You don't look official. Daniel leaned back. His jaw tightened. This was not theater. It was documentation of a culture of impunity. Every gesture, every sneer, every dismissive tone recorded the systemic abuse he had long felt but rarely seen so unambiguously. Calls began flooding his line. Internal Affairs, State Department, Legal Counsel, congressional aides. Each asked for statements, documents, and evidence. Daniel dictated calmly, measuring every word, understanding that his voice needed to be precise. Clarity was protection. You've captured everything, one aide asked. Everything, Daniel replied. And it will be corroborated with timelines, photographs, timestamps, witnesses. Transparency is non-negotiable. The officer in question had gone silent in the footage, shifting in discomfort, glancing at the camera, then away. Subtle gestures, tightened fists, pursed lips, betrayed awareness that exposure was coming. The room hummed with tension, even through a recording. Daniel's assistant entered. Sir, media wants a statement. Do you want to respond publicly? Yes, but measured. No emotion that can be twisted. Just the facts, the injustice, the systemic patterns. Highlight bias, unlawful procedure, microaggressions. No dramatics. Precision. He typed a draft. Words cut sharply. I was detained unlawfully, subjected to racial profiling, and subjected to an officer's bias under the guise of procedure. This is not personal. It is systemic. I demand accountability, transparency, and institutional reform. By afternoon, the footage had been circulated widely. Social media accounts dissected it frame by frame. Legal analysts debated the officer's violations. Public commentary swirled. Outrage, disbelief, calls for systemic review. Daniel prepared for a conference call with Internal Affairs. The senior investigator spoke first. Ambassador, the officer's statements contradict your account. Video evidence confirms your claims. We are launching a full inquiry. Do not sugarcoat this, Daniel said. I want procedural history, previous complaints, internal reviews, any incidents that reveal patterns. I will not accept token measures. Exposure without reform is meaningless. A legal advisor interjected. Sir, if this goes public, expect blowback. media framing, political pressure, and attempts to discredit you. Are you prepared? I am, Daniel replied. I am already being misrepresented. I have spent years learning to navigate this. Now the institution must learn to confront itself. Even as he spoke, alerts pinged across his phone. Comments, shares, clips, screenshots. The officer's name trended. The hashtag border bias gained traction. Yet Daniel remained focused, meticulously documenting every interaction, every report, every leak. Exposure was only a tool if wielded with intent. By evening, Daniel received a message from the junior agent. The officer requested to meet with internal investigators. Body cam footage already referenced. He's unsettled. Daniel allowed a faint nod. The system's cracks were showing. Authority, even institutional authority, could not withstand scrutiny when documented, verified, and disseminated. The officer's casual abuse was no longer invisible. It would be analyzed, judged, and recorded. He closed his laptop, leaning back in the chair. The hum of Ottawa traffic seeped through the window. Justice was no longer hypothetical. Public attention, internal review, and irrefutable evidence converged to create leverage. The officer's power, once absolute in his eyes, had limits he had underestimated. Daniel picked up a notebook, pen poised. Every conversation, every call, every step from here on would be chronicled. Exposure was just the first wave. Accountability would require persistence, precision, and unrelenting scrutiny. Even as night fell, the glow of monitors in his office reflected his resolve. He had survived the abuse of power, navigated the systems of authority, and documented their failures. Now, the officer would confront consequences, and the public would see what had been hidden for too long. For Daniel, this was only the beginning. Exposure would force action, but the fight for systemic change demanded more than cameras and headlines. It required persistence, strategy, and unyielding attention to detail. The officer's casual smirk, once impenetrable, had been fractured. He would never view authority as untouchable again. And Daniel Reed, diplomat, survivor, chronicler, would ensure that the record remained unaltered, unignored, and undeniable. The hearing room was austere, its walls bare except for the seal of the department looming above the dais. Daniel Reed entered, briefcase in hand, suit impeccable, demeanor composed. Rows of observers, staffers, legal counsel, journalists filled the seats. The officer responsible sat at the front, posture rigid, hands folded over a stack of documents, eyes darting briefly to Daniel before retreating to a neutral expression. "Ambassador Reed, please be seated," the hearing officer intoned. Daniel sat, scanning the room. Every detail mattered. Microphones angled for clarity, cameras capturing reactions, the murmurs of colleagues gauging posture and credibility. This was not a performance, but a meticulous accounting of truth versus perception. The hearing began with procedural formalities. Names, titles, and roles were read aloud. The officer recounted the incident, words chosen carefully, measured, attempting neutrality. "I followed protocol at all times," the officer said. "Detention was standard secondary inspection. No bias influenced my actions." Daniel leaned forward. "Bias is not always overt," he said, voice steady. "It can be coded, subtle, and institutional. Your tone, gestures, and selective scrutiny reveal assumptions about race and authority. This is the systemic issue, not just your individual judgment." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Are you implying misconduct?" "I am implying accountability," Daniel replied. "Intent is insufficient. Impact and precedent matter. You have created a record of actions that enforce inequity under procedural guise." Witnesses were called: border agents, supervisors, and the junior analyst who had shown hesitation. Dialogue dominated the room. Each witness revealed cracks in the official narrative, subtle contradictions, unspoken tensions. The junior analyst testified first. "Sir, I noticed inconsistencies in the officer's handling. I hesitated to intervene, but the body cam shows clear disregard for protocol when Ambassador Reed identified himself. The officer shifted, adjusting his papers. I acted under standard guidelines. I did not recognize the significance of his role at that moment. I relied on visual cues and behavior. Daniel's voice cut through the murmur. Visual cues were insufficient and biased. Your assumptions about who constitutes official behavior were influenced by the color of my skin. That is the pattern. That is the systemic failure you are now defending. The hearing officer interjected. Please focus on facts. I am, Daniel said. The facts are the treatment I received. Unlawful detention, inspection without consent, questioning of diplomatic materials. The facts are corroborated by video, witness testimony, and protocol standards. The facts reveal bias, both implicit and institutional. Cross-examination followed. Lawyers parsed every word, tested every claim. The officer's denials began to wobble under the weight of evidence. Footage from body cams, timestamps, and internal communications contradicted his statements. Dialogue revealed hesitation, defensiveness, and attempts to reframe his actions as procedural. A senior investigator asked, "Do you acknowledge that your actions deviated from standard procedure?" The officer faltered. "Deviation is subjective. Deviation is measurable," Daniel said, calm but firm. "Secondary inspections are not designed to detain diplomats unlawfully, nor to search materials protected by federal law. Your deviation was both procedural and ethical." The room was silent. Microphones captured every word. Cameras recorded reactions. Daniel maintained poise, but his mind catalogued every gesture, every pause, every line of defense. This was documentation for history, for accountability, for reform. The officer's past complaints surfaced. Minor procedural violations, unreported biases, previous instances of questionable judgment. Dialogue revealed patterns. Consistency in casual disregard for minorities, subtle exertion of authority, and reliance on euphemisms to justify discriminatory behavior. Daniel's voice grew measured, precise. Systemic patterns exist beyond this isolated incident. I urge the department to examine not only this officer's conduct but the culture that allows assumptions based on race to dictate treatment under law. The hearing adjourned temporarily. Daniel remained seated, briefcase open, reviewing notes. The officer sat opposite, flipping through forms, face tight, jaw clenched, eyes avoiding the cameras. When the hearing resumed, testimony shifted to procedural remedies. Policies, internal review mechanisms, and disciplinary guidelines were discussed. Daniel interjected only when language minimized the impact. Accountability is not symbolic. It requires transparency, consequences, and acknowledgement of harm caused. At one point the officer muttered under his breath, "This is excessive." Daniel's ears caught it. "Excessive is the claim when accountability confronts comfort," he said quietly, yet firmly. Others in the room turned, sensing tension. Witnesses continued to provide perspective. Agents who had observed prior behavior confirmed Daniel's account, and the officer's evasions became more apparent. Dialogue, once carefully scripted, now trembled under the scrutiny of cross-examination and public record. The hearing officer called for closing statements. Daniel stood. "This is not merely about one officer. This is about a system that tolerates bias, hides behind procedure, and punishes the wronged. True reform requires not only termination of the guilty party, but a cultural examination of assumptions, practices, and training that allowed this to occur." The officer's closing statement was brief. "I acted according to what I believed was protocol." Daniel remained seated, notes in hand, and replied, "Belief cannot justify harm. Accountability demands both reflection and action." The room emptied slowly, leaving Daniel with a sense of cautious anticipation. Every line of dialogue, every recorded contradiction, had been documented. The system's machinery was engaged, but now under observation. Patterns were exposed. Authority had been challenged. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of exhaust and winter frost. Daniel inhaled deeply. The hearing would not deliver instant justice. Systems moved slowly, but evidence, corroboration, and public scrutiny had shifted the momentum. The officer had power, yes, but that power was no longer unchecked. Daniel's phone buzzed. The junior analyst's text read, "They're watching now. The officer knows he can't lie without consequence." A faint, grim smile touched Daniel's lips. Exposure had evolved into confrontation. The fight was far from over, but momentum had turned. And Daniel Reed, calm, precise, unflinching, would ensure that truth prevailed through dialogue, documentation, and unrelenting persistence. Daniel Reed sat alone in his Ottawa residence, the walls lined with books on diplomacy, law, and history. Outside, snow fell silently, coating the city in muted white. Inside, the room hummed with tension, the low buzz of a phone and the faint tick of a clock marking the slow passage of hours. The public exposure and hearing had advanced the fight for accountability, but the cost weighed heavily. His spouse entered, hands folded, concern etched across the face. "How are you holding up?" Daniel did not answer immediately. His mind ran through the day's events. The officer's smirk, the administrative evasions, the repeated microaggressions. The political machinery he had navigated with precision now exacted an emotional toll he could not ignore. "I'm managing," he said finally, voice tight. But managing is different from unaffected. Every moment at the border, every subsequent hearing, reminded me that power protects those who abuse it and punishes those who endure it. His spouse nodded. "I know. But the world sees your courage." "Yes, but visibility does not erase the fear," Daniel said. He ran a hand over his forehead. "The threats that accompany exposure, emails, calls, public commentary, cannot be dismissed. My team is monitoring security, but vigilance is exhausting. And yet, silence is worse." He reviewed emails from colleagues and allies. Many expressed support. Others offered legal guidance or procedural advice. Yet beneath each message, Daniel recognized a subtle undertone: the fear of association, the hesitation to confront entrenched authority directly. He understood it all too well. Systemic bias extended beyond the checkpoint. It lived in offices, committees, and networks that prioritized self-preservation. The phone rang again. Daniel answered. "Yes. Sir, we've received threats against your staff. They're monitoring social media and public commentary. We suggest precautionary measures." He exhaled. "Implement immediately. I cannot allow collateral damage while the system corrects itself." The call ended. Daniel sat back, shoulders heavy. His work had always involved risk, but this was different. This was exposure as weaponized tension, a psychological cost layered over physical vigilance. A knock at the door drew his attention. It was a staffer with a dossier. Internal communications, leaked memos, and analysis of officer behavior patterns. Daniel scanned the contents, noting every attempt to deflect blame, every euphemism masking prejudice, every procedural loophole exploited. He documented meticulously, understanding that the fight for justice demanded both precision and endurance. Later, Daniel met with his spouse again. "I can feel the weight in every interaction," he admitted. "Every phone call, every conversation, every media clip reminds me that accountability is not guaranteed. And even when it arrives, the scars remain." "You've done everything correctly," his spouse said. "You've exposed the system without compromising your integrity." "Yes, but exposure is only one step," Daniel said. "Change is incremental, and the personal toll accumulates in quiet ways. Stress, sleep loss, the emotional labor of reliving injustice repeatedly." He walked to the window, observing snowflakes drifting in the streetlights. The world appeared calm, indifferent, unaware of the microcosm of struggle within his own life. Daniel recognized that systemic change exacts personal sacrifice. He had anticipated it intellectually, but the emotional reality was sharper than any calculation. Security updates arrived via phone, temporary protective measures for his office, monitoring of public commentary, coordination with law enforcement. Each alert reminded Daniel that power is not relinquished willingly. He had forced exposure, yet retaliation, psychological, professional, and social, remained an active variable. Dinner was quiet. Conversation avoided the border incident directly, yet the weight of it lingered in every glance, every unspoken acknowledgement. Daniel's spouse tried to offer relief, but he understood that resilience in the face of systemic injustice requires more than emotional support. It requires continuous action and strategic foresight. Later, Daniel drafted letters to key officials, requests for policy review, suggestions for training against implicit bias, and documentation of officer misconduct. Each sentence was precise, formal, and imbued with the urgency of reform. Dialogue with his team was strategic, procedural, unflinching. By nightfall, Daniel reflected on the day. Accountability had been advanced through exposure and hearings, yet the personal cost was undeniable. Emotional fatigue, stress, and vigilance formed a constant undercurrent. He had survived the direct injustice, but systemic patterns left residue, lingering distrust, hyper-awareness, and a cautious approach to authority that would not fade quickly. He finally allowed himself a moment of stillness. The snow continued to fall. Outside, the city was indifferent, yet inside, meticulous documentation, careful strategy, and personal resolve formed a bulwark against injustice. Daniel understood the truth. Real change requires sacrifice, persistence, and unwavering attention to detail. Even as he prepared for another day of scrutiny and action, he accepted the cost: emotional, psychological, and relational. This was the burden of accountability and the price of exposing entrenched power. Daniel Reed would endure it, not for recognition, but for the principle that justice must be enforced, even when painful. The boardroom smelled of polished wood and anticipation. Daniel Reed entered with his briefcase in hand, a calm exterior masking the tension that had settled over him for weeks. Inside, the department leadership awaited, seated behind a long, polished table. Cameras, recording devices, and microphones were positioned to capture every word, every gesture. The officer responsible sat across from them, his posture rigid, eyes darting nervously. "Ambassador Reed," the senior investigator began, "we have concluded our internal review. Findings are ready to be presented." Daniel nodded, hands folded on the briefcase. He had prepared for this moment meticulously, knowing that exposure alone did not guarantee consequence. Evidence had to be irrefutable, patterns undeniable. The investigator continued. "Our review confirms that the officer violated procedural protocols. He detained you unlawfully, conducted searches without consent, and displayed behavior influenced by racial bias. We recommend termination and formal charges for misconduct." A murmur rippled through the room. Daniel remained silent, absorbing the words, watching the officer. The man's face was pale, jaw tight, hands clenched. Authority, once wielded without consequence, now faced accountability. "You have the right to respond," the investigator added. The officer's voice trembled slightly. I followed what I thought were standard procedures. I did not intend harm." Daniel leaned forward. "Intent does not erase impact. Accountability is not optional, nor is remorse sufficient when procedural violations reinforce systemic injustice. Your actions have consequences, both legally and socially." A lawyer interjected, reminding the officer of his rights and the formal process. Daniel watched closely as the officer's attempts to rationalize and reframe his behavior collapsed under the weight of evidence. Each contradiction, each evasion was documented and undeniable. The department leadership reviewed the compiled footage, testimonies, and reports. Patterns emerged clearly. Prior complaints overlooked, previous incidents dismissed, and a culture that tolerated assumptions based on race. Dialogue revealed subtle defenses and justifications, but all were insufficient against irrefutable documentation. Finally, the lead investigator addressed Daniel directly. "Ambassador, your documentation, testimony, and the corroborating evidence have ensured that the system cannot ignore these violations. The officer's termination and formal charges are now official." Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension easing marginally. Justice, measured and procedural, had been served. Yet he recognized the emotional and systemic costs that remained. Victory was procedural, not personal. Outside the formal proceedings, media coverage escalated. News outlets reported the officer's termination, the charges filed, and the systemic issues revealed. Public commentary applauded accountability but also demanded broader reform. Daniel noted the tone of each report, knowing that true change required sustained attention, not ephemeral headlines. A senior official approached Daniel privately. "Your insistence on thorough documentation and exposure has forced institutional accountability. This is unprecedented." Daniel's voice was steady. "It is not unprecedented because of me. It is unprecedented because authority was confronted with undeniable evidence. Accountability is only meaningful if systemic patterns are addressed, not just individual failures." Back at his office, Daniel reviewed memos detailing policy changes, mandatory implicit bias training, new review protocols for secondary inspections, and stricter oversight of officers with repeated complaints. Dialogue with colleagues centered on implementation, timelines, and safeguards to prevent recurrence. Even as procedural justice was achieved, Daniel reflected on the human cost. Emotional strain, public scrutiny, and the burden of constant vigilance had left their mark. He had navigated exposure, hearings, and systemic inertia, yet personal resilience came at a price. Conversations with his spouse and team emphasized the ongoing tension between professional duty and emotional well-being. That evening, Daniel returned to the border checkpoint, not as a detainee but as an observer. Cameras recorded, officers monitored, procedures scrutinized. The officer's absence was noted, his authority curtailed. Systems were being adjusted, but the work was far from complete. Daniel spoke quietly to a junior agent at the checkpoint. "Accountability is one step. Systemic change requires persistence, vigilance, and documentation. Never assume progress is permanent." The agent nodded. Daniel observed the procedures, interactions, and subtle dynamics between officers and travelers. The lessons were clear. Authority must be held accountable, and bias confronted consistently, or injustice will persist. The officer responsible had lost his position, faced formal charges, and been publicly exposed. Power had limits, and those limits were now visible. Yet Daniel knew that systemic bias extended beyond one individual. Institutional inertia, cultural assumptions, and habitual disregard required ongoing vigilance. As night fell, Daniel walked along the checkpoint perimeter, the lights casting long shadows on concrete. The eagle emblem above the border office gleamed faintly in the glow. Justice had been administered, but vigilance remained essential. Daniel Reed, diplomat, survivor, and chronicler of events, understood the delicate balance between procedural accountability and personal cost. Systems could be confronted and corrected, but the work demanded endurance. And so he walked on, resolute, aware that judgment had been delivered, but the fight for reform was continuous, meticulous, and unyielding. Months had passed since the officer's termination and the public exposure of his misconduct. The border checkpoint remained the same in structure: concrete lanes, floodlights, and glass-walled inspection booths, but the air had shifted. Procedures were scrutinized, new protocols implemented, and officers underwent training on implicit bias, documentation, and legal compliance. Change was slow, deliberate, and visible in subtle gestures. An officer double-checking paperwork, a supervisor monitoring body cam usage, a junior agent hesitating before assuming authority. Daniel Reed returned to the checkpoint as part of a diplomatic delegation. His arrival was calm, formal, and deliberate. Uniformed officers approached, offering protocol guidance. The new environment felt different, tempered by accountability, yet he remained alert. Momentum had shifted, but systemic vigilance was necessary. He passed through the lanes, observing travelers and officers alike. Microaggressions were less frequent. Procedural respect was enforced. Yet Daniel noticed the residue of the past. The cautious glances, the minor hesitations, the subtle measures of self-protection that persisted even under scrutiny. Culture does not change overnight. A junior officer, familiar from previous interactions, greeted him respectfully. "Ambassador Reed," she said, "we've implemented the reforms you suggested. Body cams are mandatory for secondary inspections. Supervisors review all procedures daily." Daniel nodded, eyes scanning the checkpoint. "Good. Policies are only effective if observed consistently. Enforcement matters more than guidelines." Inside the inspection booth, he spoke briefly with staff, emphasizing that diligence and documentation were now non-negotiable. Dialogue was precise, authoritative, and measured. Authority must serve the public fairly. Respect is not optional. Accountability is continuous. Later, Daniel stepped outside the checkpoint. The floodlights illuminated asphalt lanes, puddles reflecting sharp lines of light. He allowed himself a moment to reflect on the journey, from unlawful detention to public exposure, hearings, and systemic reform. The officer responsible had been removed from power, policies changed, and public awareness heightened. Yet the emotional cost, the anxiety, vigilance, and subtle trauma, remained a quiet undercurrent. He recalled the moment when body cam footage had first revealed the officer's bias, the microaggressions that had escalated into unlawful detention. Each step thereafter, the documentation, internal reviews, hearings, and public exposure, had been strategic, precise, and emotionally taxing. Daniel understood that reform came with responsibility. Constant monitoring, measured intervention, and unyielding attention to the behavior of those in power. The checkpoint, while physically unchanged, symbolized progress. Systems were now accountable. Policies reflected lessons learned. Officers understood the consequences of unchecked authority. Yet Daniel's eyes remained vigilant, knowing that latent bias could emerge at any moment. The fight for justice was ongoing, even when procedural victories were achieved. He walked to the perimeter, observing officers interacting with travelers. Each action was measured, deliberate, and recorded. Accountability had become routine, but vigilance ensured it remained meaningful. Daniel reflected on the cost: emotional, procedural, and societal. Justice had been administered, but resilience and foresight remained essential. A young agent approached him quietly. "Sir, we've seen a change in culture. Officers are more mindful. Travelers are treated respectfully. Your advocacy has had a real impact." Daniel looked at her, expression composed. Culture shifts slowly. Today's compliance does not guarantee tomorrow's fairness. Documentation, monitoring, and accountability are permanent responsibilities. Never assume progress is final. He stepped back from the checkpoint, snow beginning to fall lightly, coating the asphalt in white. The eagle emblem gleamed faintly above the building, a symbol both of authority and of the promise he had fought to enforce. He understood that while individual abuse could be addressed, systemic vigilance required unending commitment. As he walked away, the floodlights cast elongated shadows across the concrete lanes. The journey from harassment to reform had been arduous, precise, and fraught with emotional cost. The officer responsible had faced consequences. Policies had changed. Culture had shifted. Yet the memory of abuse, the awareness of systemic risk, and the responsibility to maintain accountability remained indelible. Daniel Reed paused, allowing the quiet of the night to settle around him. He had navigated injustice, exposed authority, and ensured procedural and public accountability. Yet the work of vigilance, advocacy, and reform continued beyond individual victories. In that silence, he understood the final lesson. Authority is only just when held to scrutiny. systems only fair when continuously observed, and justice only meaningful when combined with resilience. The crossing had been made, reforms enacted, accountability enforced, but the responsibility to monitor, document, and confront bias would remain as long as power existed. He turned back for one final glance at the checkpoint. Lights glimmered on wet asphalt, officers moved with attentive precision, travelers passed without incident. Systems were in motion, and authority had been reminded of its limits. Daniel Reed, steady, deliberate, and unyielding, walked into the night, prepared to ensure that justice remained vigilant, continuous, and uncompromising. The courtroom was bright, sterile, and unyielding. Daniel Reed sat at the plaintiff's table, folders stacked neatly, every page flagged. Cameras clicked intermittently, capturing the tension. The officer responsible for his detention sat across the aisle, posture rigid, hands gripping the edges of the table, knuckles white. The judge's gavel echoed. This session addresses the charges against Officer Daniels for unlawful detention and abuse of power. Proceedings will examine evidence, witness testimony, and patterns of conduct. The prosecution began, projecting the body cam footage onto the wall. The officer leaned forward, shifting uncomfortably as every smirk, dismissive glance, and illegal action was magnified for all to see. "Officer Daniels," the lead prosecutor said, voice precise, "explain why Ambassador Reed's diplomatic status was ignored." The officer swallowed. "I followed protocol." "I did not." "Protocol does not justify racial profiling or unlawful searches," the prosecutor interrupted, each word sharp. "Your actions were documented, witnessed, and recorded. They violated federal regulations and international diplomatic protections." Daniels' counsel stood. "Your Honor, we have presented patterns of behavior, previous complaints ignored, and systemic failure. This is not isolated misconduct. It reflects institutional tolerance of bias." Witnesses were called: junior agents, internal auditors, and procedural experts. Each testimony reinforced the same narrative. The officer acted with casual certainty, shielded by bureaucracy, unchecked by immediate supervision. Daniel observed, noting subtle shifts in the officer's demeanor, small cracks forming in a facade of authority. The officer attempted defense. "I did not intend harm. I was following procedures as I understood them." Daniel's words, when allowed, were measured. Intent does not excuse impact. Systemic bias thrives where actions are unchecked, where appearance determines suspicion. Consequences are not punitive fantasy. They are accountability for structural harm. Questions from the panel drilled into prior incidents, training records, and complaint history. The officer faltered, unable to reconcile recorded evidence with personal narrative. Each cross-examination revealed gaps, evasions, and the repeated misuse of authority. Public observers leaned forward as the judge reviewed evidence aloud, citing deviations from policy and the repeated dismissal of complaints. Silence filled the room when the body cam footage played again, the officer's casual aggression stark, unambiguous, and indefensible. The verdict approached. The judge's voice was calm, unyielding. "Officer Daniels is found guilty of unlawful detention, racial profiling, and abuse of power. Sentencing will follow institutional guidelines, including termination and criminal charges as warranted. Procedural reforms are recommended for the border authority." The officer lowered his head. Authority stripped, posture collapsed. Power once absolute reduced to consequence. Daniel remained seated, expression neutral but body taut with the accumulated weight of the fight. The courtroom had affirmed justice in structure, if not in emotional restitution. Outside, media recorded statements, analysis, and public reactions. Daniel's statement was deliberate. "Accountability has been established. This is a structural issue, not an isolated incident. Policy reforms must follow. Silence or symbolic gestures without systemic change are insufficient." Outside, the cold air pressed against Daniel's face. Streetlights reflected on wet pavement, fractured into shards by puddles. The officer had fallen. The system was confronted, though still imperfect. The junior agent who had hesitated months ago watched from a distance, recognition in his eyes. Not everyone had surrendered to indifference. Daniel walked forward, briefcase in hand, noting every observer, every reaction. The fight had been long, precise, and exhausting. The officer's power had been dismantled through documentation, exposure, and insistence on procedure. Justice had been served, not as revenge, but as consequence. Systemic failures had been exposed, patterns documented, and accountability enforced. Daniel understood the personal toll. Sleep lost, trust strained, vigilance maintained. Yet the record was now unambiguous. The officer would face institutional sanctions, criminal proceedings, and public condemnation. Daniel had turned bias into evidence, authority into transparency, and silence into record. Every conversation, every note, every recording had contributed to this reckoning. Daniel's fight had been procedural, deliberate, and relentless. Outside the courthouse, the night pressed close, lights flickered on reflective pavement, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel exhaled with measured relief. The reckoning was complete, yet the work of ensuring systemic change had only begun. Every step forward required vigilance. Every policy, review, and enforcement now carried the weight of precedent. Daniel walked to the waiting SUV. Engines hummed. Headlights pierced darkness. Authority had limits. Justice had been affirmed. Consequence had been applied. The system, imperfect, had been confronted and forced to reckon with its failures. Daniel Reed, diplomat and chronicler, had ensured the record remained indelible. Months later, the northern border checkpoint looked unchanged. Floodlights bright, lanes funneling vehicles, guards performing routines. But Daniel Reed saw the difference beneath the surface. Policies had shifted, procedures updated, cameras installed, training reinforced. The system had been forced to confront its failures, though imperfection lingered. Daniel approached in an official vehicle, ID ready, posture neutral. Officers recognized him immediately. This time there was no delay, no microaggressions, no casual dismissiveness. The checkpoint operated efficiently, procedural, unflinching, but human awareness had improved. A junior agent approached him. Recognition in his eyes, cautious respect. "Ambassador Reed," he said. "Procedures updated. We've incorporated the reforms." Daniel nodded, brief, measured. "Observe them. Enforce them." Inside the checkpoint office, he reviewed reports of secondary inspections over the last quarter. Patterns of bias had been flagged and addressed. Officers who had previously skirted protocol now faced accountability. Policies were documented, training mandatory. The institution had shifted, structural awareness increasing, though not perfect. He walked the lanes, observing, noting interactions, seeing both compliance and moments of hesitation. Authority, once absolute and unchecked, now carried consequence. The officer who had detained him had been terminated, criminally charged, and publicly reprimanded. Symbolic, but paired with structural reform, it carried weight. Daniel paused at the glass doors of the checkpoint, hands resting lightly on the counter. He reflected on the months of legal battles, hearings, public scrutiny, and personal strain. The fight had exacted a cost. Sleep lost, relationships tested, vigilance demanded. Yet the exposure had created precedent. A convoy passed, diplomats and officials entering without delay, clearance granted efficiently. Daniel noted the small gestures. Officers attentive, forms precise, scrutiny impartial. The systemic shift was tangible. He turned back to the waiting SUV. Headlights glimmered on wet asphalt. Reflection fractured in puddles mirrored the fractured institution, imperfect but corrected in part. He had enforced accountability through documentation, patience, and precise insistence on procedure. As the vehicle pulled away, Daniel allowed a measured breath. The border no longer represented arbitrary power unchecked. It represented a system forced to reckon, to respect, to enforce law over bias. The fight had been procedural, precise, and public. The human cost remained, but structural change had been achieved. Outside, the floodlights hummed, the cold night pressing close. Daniel thought of the junior agents, the officers willing to follow reform, the witnesses who had chronicled truth. Accountability had transformed fear into procedure, bias into evidence, silence into record. He glanced at the city skyline in the distance, lights cutting through fog. The institution had been altered, not redeemed entirely. Justice had been served through consequence and reform. Exposure had forced authority to reckon. Daniel Reed, diplomat and chronicler, sat back in the SUV, eyes scanning the horizon. The system had learned a lesson it could not forget. Bias had been confronted, power had been challenged, and precedent had been established. The fight for equity, for accountability, for systemic recognition continued, but a tangible step had been taken. Authority now knew that actions, however casual, had consequences. And Daniel Reed, survivor, strategist, witness, would ensure that the record remained indelible.